When did you go into the Army and why?
I lost my 2S deferment due to fault of my own. And so I started looking for alternatives. I didn't want to be an infantryman.
Mm.
So I went to the Air Force and they said I needed 4 years of college to fly. The Navy said I needed 2 years. I didn't have any of that. I
Yeah.
happened to see a sign about helicopters in the Army. So I went over there and they said I needed a high school education. And I thought,
Okay.
I had never flown before. I had never even flown in an airplane before.
Wow.
But I decided, well, hey, school is going to be 9 months long and the whole thing will be over by the time I get out of school a year from now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So
And,
that's how naive I was.
and was this 66 when you then enlisted in the Army?
Yes, it was in June. It was just before my birthday, just before my 19th birthday, like 6 days before my 19th birthday.
Wow, 1966. You said you lost your deferment. What happened there?
I was going to a junior college and I had a 4 o'clock in the afternoon English class. And it was in Mason City, Iowa, which the weather is not pleasant in January and February.
Mm.
And my other classes ended at 1. And we were writing a paper about what do you want to do when you grow up, basically. And we were given small instructions, but basically we were trudging to this Quonset hut that was cold, wet, and damp, and bringing our materials with us, writing notes and doing the work in class, which obviously could have been done anywhere.
Mm.
So I started skipping classes because I had other alternatives. I could go to work at the grocery store and I needed the money.
Mm.
If that wasn't available, I could go downtown and play pool with my friends, which I've been playing at the Y for years and years.
Yeah.
Or I could go see my girlfriend up in Rochester, was in nursing school.
Okay. Yeah.
So they called 12 of us in because we were skipping classes and said, if we missed one more class, they'd kick us out. I did not know that they were receiving state aid based on English class attendance.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
And I called their bluff because I was on the dean's list. They're not going to kick me out, but they did. So I lost my 2S deferment.
Now, did it ever cross your mind that, even though you assumed, you would be able to squeak by for some reason, that if for some reason you didn't squeak by, that you would lose your deferment and then might end up going to a place called Vietnam? Did that ever cross your mind that if I don't make it through school, then I might end up in uniform?
No, at that time I was terribly naive and I didn't realize that until I actually lost my deferment.
Wow. Did you say you were in Iowa?
Mason City, Iowa, about halfway between Des Moines and the Twin Cities.
So in 66, things are heating up. It's not 67, 68, 69, but things are heating up in Vietnam. To what extent were you even aware at that time that there was a significant conflict brewing in Southeast Asia?
I was aware something was going on, but that's about it because I was not a history buff. I did not read the news often. And,
Wow.
I was, like I said, terribly naive.
Yeah.
Just a young kid going to, working around town and my parents weren't terribly aware either. Now, I no discredit to them, but they weren't well educated, although they were intelligent enough, but they grew up in the Depression. And my dad was the only member of his family or my mom's family that actually participated in World War II.
Right. Now you did though enlist, you weren't drafted?
Yeah, I had to enlist, and I enlisted only on the guarantee that I would get to flight school. But to get to that guarantee, I had to go down and take an exam, which was basically an aptitude test.
Right.
I'm guessing. And actually, when I got back from the exam, the recruiter was surprised that I passed it, or at least he said that. And so,
maybe based on recent history.
Yeah.
So when you actually do enlist and now you're in the Army or on your way to the Army, did you then begin to pay more attention to what was happening overseas, or were you still
No,
kind of
not really. No, I was
walking in the dark?
basically until near the end of flight school, I was not paying attention to what was going on over there.
Wow. So yeah, that's interesting. Now, what was it? You said that you didn't want to be infantry, but yet you had never flown. So what was it that attracted you to fly?
Um,
Or what was it that made you not want to be infantry?
well, I just did not want to be infantry. I didn't want to carry a rifle and be on that line, front line. And I don't know what made me want to fly. Well, the biggest thing about the flight in school, I thought it'd be fun to fly, and flight school was 9 months long. It was one of the longest Army schools that they had that you could enroll for.
Yeah.
So it was going to put back my timeline as long as anything could. Now, if I did not graduate from flight school, it was only a 2-year enlistment. So,
Oh, okay.
but if I did graduate from flight school, then it was the 3 years after graduation.
But
Yeah,
your thought was, flight school's long enough. By the time I'm done, this whatever this thing is going on overseas will be over, and I won't have to worry about
yeah. I was completely unaware of the whole situation as a total thing, at that time.
it. Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, I'm a young 19-year-old kid that's been just going to school and having fun and
Yeah.
not studying much. And
Now you were 19 when you went into the Army, and how old were you when you came home from Vietnam?
I had just turned 21 2 months before.
When you see 21-year-olds now or 20-year-olds now, does it pass through your mind of just how mind-boggling that is, that this, behind you, the image behind you, we've got a Chinook there, and that's what you end up flying in 2 Corps in Vietnam. I mean, does that thought ever go through your mind that it's mind-boggling that a person so young was handed a machine that expensive and that complicated in a situation that serious? I mean, have you ever found yourself looking at a 20-year-old and saying, that's how young I was when I was doing all this?
Well, yes, I have, but now, as I stated in that thing I sent you, when I got there, the pilots that were there were all very mature pilots. We actually had 2 World War II pilots that became warrants so that they could fly in Vietnam. But the W3s and W4s were on their second tour to Vietnam, and they'd flown H-21s on their first tour supporting Arbenz. Then there were a few W2s that had been spent their time in Germany primarily for their first tour. And they were over there as their first tour, but they again had 3 or 4 years of flight experience because the Chinook was a different animal. And before my class, all the people that went to Chinook school were very experienced pilots. That's why it was such a shock to my company commander to see a 20-year-old kid qualified in Chinooks.
Yeah.
With only 250 hours of flying time. That was a shock to him. And he told me right off the bat, you're never going to be an aircraft commander. You're too young and you're too inexperienced.
Wow. Now, did he end up being wrong about that?
Very wrong about that, because all the replacements after me were also young and inexperienced. By the time I left, I was training these young kids that were coming after me, but they hadn't seen anyone my age anywhere near a Chinook when I got there.
Wow, that's amazing.
But I was extremely lucky in that regard because my mentors were all very experienced, good pilots. There was a couple of pilots from World War II, and there were other older pilots that were in their late 20s and early 30s.
Yeah.
And I was 20 years old.
That is unbelievable. Now, you arrive in country in 1967, then. Is it November 67 you arrive?
No, it was August of '67 I arrived.
Okay, August of 67 you arrived. And like a lot of other soldiers going to Vietnam, did you fly on a
Oh yeah, we flew
commercial
commercial,
plane over?
made a stop in Japan just for fuel, and then flew on and arrived in the middle of the night in Cameron Bay.
Cameron Bay. Do you have any recollections of that flight over? I mean, I wouldn't expect that you'd remember specific conversations, although perhaps you do, but just kind of the feel of that flight, the spirit of that flight, the vibe of that flight. I mean, what was that like? You've got,
Well,
because when you're there, I mean, the war really is heating up now in August 67. What was it like on the plane when it's a long flight to
again, I was
go home?
pretty naive, and I went over the flight and I sat next to Floyd Littlefield, who had been a friend of mine in flight school. We'd been in the same platoon. Actually, we'd gone through basic training together. We went through flight school together, and then we went to Chinook school together. He was a few years older. He was probably 4 or 5 years older, and he was married, and he already had been flying fixed wings and was trying to become a commercial pilot before he went to flight school. But so, I mean, I talked to Floyd and we were just, yeah, we're going to Vietnam. And yeah, I, I had no idea what I was getting into. And the training was actually inadequate in that regard. The only field training we had, we were in tents. And although a lot of helicopter pilots ended up in tents, our situation ended to be remarkably different than that. We were stationed in a compound that was fairly secure, and we lived in hooches instead of tents. And Floyd lived down by Cameron Bay. I mean, he could go skiing and get rent a ski boat from the Air Force across the bay, and
Yeah,
you know,
that's a beautiful area. There's no question about it. And if you don't have mortars coming in on you and you're able to enjoy the beach, that can,
oh, they were never mortared down there.
yeah, yeah. So it sounds like, you referred to yourself at this period of your life, we haven't opened the door yet, and you haven't yet felt that Vietnam air. But still, when you're on the plane over, it sounds like you're still that young person you have described as naive. Is that still kind of,
Yeah, I was very naive.
you knew you were going to a war zone, but that hadn't really registered yet?
That had registered, and my expectations were different than when we arrived. We were shuffled onto a bus, and the bus started driving through the countryside, and I thought that was surreal.
Why is
Actually,
that?
because I had no idea that the Cameron Peninsula was so secure.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. So were you
So here we
saying,
are in the middle of the night, getting on a bus and driving through the countryside.
and where were you going?
Well, we were only going further down on the peninsula to where they had a reception station for people that coming in country.
Okay. And what made it surreal? Just that it was so peaceful and seemingly nice?
Yeah, it was the middle of the night, and we were just shuffled onto a bus and driven away.
Did the bus, often when folks talk about getting off the plane and onto a bus, they'll mention the metal grating on the windows to prevent hand grenades from coming through the windows. Do you remember that at all?
I did, but
Yeah.
and that added to the thing of being, this is weird.
What was your very first impression of Vietnam? The way I often think of it is, you've left the United States and now you're kind of in this American bubble aboard this plane, and then you land. Sometimes veterans say, the landing is, it's a very, steep descent. But you land, and then the door opens, and now you have your first physical experience of Vietnam.
It's hot and humid.
Yeah.
It's hot and humid. In August in Vietnam, it was hot and humid. You're right on the water there.
Yeah.
And it was hot and humid. And we started sweating immediately. and continue to sweat for a long time.
And often vets will also mention the smell, that there's a distinct smell that struck them.
I did not remember that.
Yeah,
There may have been, but I don't recall that.
sure. You know in the abstract that you're going into a war zone, but at some point it becomes concrete and you really know. I mean, it's certain because you've seen something, you've experienced something that drives the point home to you that this is a war zone. What was the first thing you saw or experienced that really drove the point home to you that that you were in a war zone?
Well, it became less surreal when I got down there, and then they assigned us, and they flew us on a C-123 to another place, and we were reassigned. Floyd ended up going back to near Cameron Bay, and I ended up on a Huey flying up to Pleiku. But I didn't. By now, things are kind of normalized, and everything seems to be kind of normal. So I didn't see any fighting. I didn't see any. There were no reports at that time that I'd heard yet. And then I was put on Camp Holloway. I was introduced a couple of days later to flying, but we just made a short flight over to the Idarang Valley and made an approach, and still nothing there. I don't think that then I went with Vern Maddie up to Dak To, but things were quiet up there, and they were shooting guns off old Dak To towards the border then, and the first real scare I got was when I was hovering over one of those guns, because we were taking stuff from old Dak To to new Dak To, and they let an 8-inch gun go off just right underneath our belly.
Oh, wow.
That did scare the heck out of me.
Yeah.
But then a half hour later, I was back, and we were flying back and forth between two relatively close places for 25 hours there, and then we went home. Now, when we got back to back to Pleiku, it was probably a week or so before I started hearing reports, mostly outgoing mortars shooting flares. It probably was a couple of weeks before we heard the first incoming rounds. They typically would drop a round or two, and they were typically shooting at aircraft on the flight line. So these reports were, hundreds of yards away, but still it was incoming. And you could tell the difference between outgoing and incoming. That's when you really understood that, yeah, I'm in a combat zone.
Yeah, here you are. And you spend the year in two corps then, is that right? Pleiku, Camp Holloway, Dak To, that area?
And from Bamituit up to Dak Tech, all in two corps, that was our support area. The first part of the year in the rainy season, more time was spent down on Bamituit and places south because it was flatter, and we were resupplying places in coffee plantations, and everything was flat and it was easy to fly.
Yeah.
We didn't do a lot of flying up north. I mean, my first flight was up to Dak To, but when we got up to Dak To, the fire bases at that time were in the valleys, and they could be resupplied by truck, usually if it wasn't too muddy. And we did go up there and fly a little bit in the valleys and carry loads to the artillery, but the artillery was all based near roads in the valley. It wasn't until the season started to change that they started moving the fire bases from the valleys up to the hilltops.
Okay, I see.
And then their resupply became dependent upon the Chinooks. And that's when we did a lot of flying. And I did most of my flying, quite frankly, north of Pleiku from Kontum to Dak To, and a little bit up to Dak Pek, but not a lot.
And was this the bulk, I know that you flew a lot of different kinds of missions, but was this the primary work you did, keeping these artillery fire bases supplied, keeping the guys there supplied?
That was 95% of what we did.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
were hauling loads from a place that a plane could land, like Dak To, that had a runway that the C-130s could come in. And then we flew it from there to the fire bases. We flew their water, we flew their rations, and we flew their ammunition. The Hueys flew the mail and flew the people in and out of those fire bases. But
Hmm.
anything that you could put in a sling load is what we carried. Now, this is again how we varied from the first Cav, because they carried a lot of people too in the Chinooks, but they had 3 Chinook companies in their division, and we were a lone Chinook company supporting the 4th Division.
Hmm.
We also had a part of the 173rd attached.
Now I've read your memoirs, a work in progress, and you're writing it for your family, but you very kindly let me read it. And if I remember correctly, you say something like one of the most gratifying experiences you had was bringing, I think, food to guys around Thanksgiving or something like that. Do I have that?
Thanksgiving Day, I spent about 10 hours flying hot rations from Dak To, where they had a mess hall, and they put them in canisters that we loaded internally, and we flied out to all these fire bases and took a meal to them. This is one of the few times that I actually got to see the troops on the ground, because they
Hmm.
would typically hide when we were bringing in sling loads, but we landed there long enough for them to unload the canisters onto the into the fire base so that they eat hot lunch. And I got to see guys then too, and they were smiling at the fact that we were bringing them hot food.
Hmm.
They didn't get hot food very often up there
Yeah,
in those fire
relying on
bases.
those
I
sea
did that
rations.
all day, fly out of Dak To into different fire bases. I think we hit every fire base around there at the time, and they got hot food off the Chinook. And it's one of the rare times that we actually carried internal loads.
One of the rare times, I'm sorry.
We carried internal loads. Almost all of our work was done with sling loads off the
I
hook.
see. Okay. So
The
for that,
Chinook was nicknamed the Hook.
hmm. So for
Or
that reason, you're not landing very often then, since you're carrying things by
no,
string.
no, no, no. We'll go an hour and a half without touching the ground.
Wow.
Uh,
Hmm.
we refuel, we go pick up a load by sling load, carry it out to the fire base, drop it off, come back and get another sling load. Our wheels don't touch the ground until it's time to refuel again.
Wow. I want to ask about another story you write related to the sling load, but why was that so meaningful to you, bringing food to these guys on Thanksgiving? Why, when you look back on your year, is that the event that
Because these
um
guys were happy that we were there. You could see them smiling. They were just tickled to help us unload those. And they didn't get hot food out there. This was
yeah,
a rare event for them. And
yeah.
the fact that we could help them like that just made me feel good.
Was that related then to a sense that these guys who are living out in the field,
Yeah,
they,
these guys were roughing it out there. They had I had an officers club 30 feet away from our hooches,
mm,
and I lived inside. There was no air conditioning, but uh,
mm,
my meals were mostly at the officers club.
mm,
We had steak and lobster sometimes when it was available. Relative to what they were doing, we didn't have it good compared to the Air Force. They had it, even better, but we had it really pretty good.
mm. So there's that sense of, doing something for the guys who, objectively we can say they've got it, pretty tough out here living in the
By comparison. The artillery didn't have it quite well. They did have it as tough in some ways, but they weren't like the infantry up there. I mean, this country up there at the time was triple canopy stuff, so the infantry slugging through those jungles, that was miserable. There
Mm,
were snakes and leeches, and oh man, that was certainly something I didn't want to do.
right. I think you tell a story of one of the sling loads you carried. I think it was a water buffalo. Is that right? What's the water
That was
buffalo?
a very unusual, well, there were two occasions when we helped move mountain yard villages. Now, these were native people, kind of like the native Indians, if you will. They were darker skinned, smaller people, and they lived in the mountains.
Hmm.
But they tended to support the French, and then they supported us. Well, sometimes their villages became untenable because of obviously the North Vietnam. They were not friendly to the mountain yards. North Vietnamese weren't.
Hmm.
So when their villages became untenable, we actually moved two of them to a new location that was, quote, safer, end quote.
Hmm.
And we moved everything they had. And this is one of the rare times that we did carry internal loads. And we would put 50 of those people in there along with all their belongings, goats and chickens and whatever they had, and move them from one location to another. Typically, the flight was about 30 minutes long, too. So we moved them quite a way. And this one particular load, they
Hmm.
wanted one of their water buffalo. You can see water buffalo there in that picture behind me.
Yeah.
They wanted one of their water buffalo moved. So dutifully, somebody figured out how to put a sling around that thing, and we did carry it. But this was in between the wet season and the dry season, so there were occasional showers around. In a 30-minute flight, we managed to go through 2 showers
I
to
think
try
you
to
wrote. Yeah,
wet
I
the
think.
animal from the. We figured that the skin had to be getting terribly
Yeah,
dry, going.
yeah. If I remember right, you wrote that you actually, intentionally went through the rain
Yes, we did.
to wet down
We
this poor
weaved a
water
little
buffalo.
bit to get to a couple places to get them to hydrate the skin. We thought that was important. I was flying with I don't know where the guy was from, but he was by this time I'm flying with all these old guys. I say old
Yeah,
guys, they're in their late 20s and 30s,
yeah.
but they're
You seem like senior
very
citizens.
experienced pilots.
The water buffalo survives the flight, but you don't know if it had a heart attack, the day after. Okay,
Well, it ran away when we took the sling off from it, but
after it contemplated what it had been through. Oh, that's mind-boggling. Now, by this time, had you seen so much stuff in Vietnam that, I'm imagining a Chinook, and in the Chinook, you've got all these montagnards plus their animals, um, which I imagine is going to come along with various sounds and things,
and
um,
smells.
and smells. By this time, had you seen so much in Vietnam that it didn't even occur to you that, this was kind of an unusual event, or
Oh
as
no, it was a
as
very
they were.
unusual event.
Okay.
I mean, because like I said, almost entirely what we did was take stuff from someplace where there was a runway to an
Yeah.
artillery base somewhere. So this was an extremely unusual event.
Yeah, and I mean, at the time, not only unusual in that, okay, this isn't something we do very much, but did it seem, earlier you used the word surreal. I mean, did this seem sort of surreal that we're moving a village of people plus their animals from one place to another? Did it have
Well, it
that
was just
quality?
very unusual.
Yeah,
It was so atypical that it was, you know,
yeah, yeah. That's something.
it surprised me the first time we did that. But we're going to do what?
Mm, yeah,
We're going to move a village? Really?
golly, that's something. Um, I know that you spend, is it one night in Saigon?
Just one night.
Yeah.
Um, and that was because we had to replace our aircraft when major maintenance was due. And this particular aircraft was coming up on its 1,000-hour inspection, and that's not something that our maintenance detachment was capable of doing that.
Okay.
So they had a major place to rebuild them down in Saigon. So we flew this Chinook that was approaching 1,000 hours, and we flew it down to Saigon. We picked up a one that was just off the boat there and flew it back, and it became part of our company.
Okay. So
And
you,
the reason we stayed overnight is because there was a significant flight in between. And so we had to test flight the aircraft before we took it back
Oh,
dutifully. So we started in the morning again, going back.
yeah. And so you did have the one night in Saigon, and are we talking about early or mid 68 now by this time?
No, no, we're still talking 67. This was late 67.
The late
It was,
67.
but it was, yeah, it was before Tet and it was before the Battle of Dak To. So it had to have been maybe October or September, October. It was relatively when I was still pretty young and
Yeah,
new to
okay.
the country.
Pretty early in your tour then.
Yeah.
So you weren't in Saigon long, but what recollections do you have of Saigon at that time and sort of the, the second part of
Well,
67?
we were out at the Air Force Base, and they said, "Well, you're going to stay downtown tonight." I said, "Well, what?" So they took us in a Jeep downtown, and they took us to a hotel down there and said, "We'll pick you up in the morning."
Wow. Did they tell you to stay
And on the way
inside?
down, I mean, there was a lot of, the motorcycles and that sort of things, and the little motorbikes that had three wheels that they used for carts and that sort of thing in the streets. Weren't many cars at all, but it was a busy city.
Did you go out in the town at all, or did you stay in the hotel?
Well, we did go to a bar or whatever nearby that had some entertainment. We went there for a few hours and then we went back to the hotel. And I didn't really sleep very well that night. I was still very anxious about being out here like this. I again, you're 19 years old, and
Hmm,
there's a lot of things you don't understand.
sure. So it sounds like you didn't, venture far from the hotel.
No, we didn't.
Um,
No, no,
but
less than a block.
what kinds of interactions did you have with Vietnamese? We mentioned the Montagnards that you're moving on the Chinook. What about with Vietnamese themselves on the base, elsewhere? What sort of interactions
Oh,
did
we
you
had
have?
we had two mama sons. There were women that came, and there was two assigned to each hooch, and
Hmm.
there was 8 officers in each hooch, and they would come and wash our clothes. They would shine our boots. They would clean the hooch for us. That's what they did every day. And so we had well-shined boots, as if you were in a garrison and back in the States. We had clean clothes, and they cleaned the place for us. They kept it clean.
Did you feel that
We
you,
paid them a small fee, and I mean, the 8 of us paid them a small fee, but it was a huge amount of money for them.
yeah,
That one mama san, at one point, much later, before Tet though, invited me out to her house, which it was down in Pleiku. It's one of the few times I went off base. Um,
hmm,
but I went with another fellow down there that was a little bit older, and we took a Jeep and we found her place. And she was so excited to have us meet her family and show us her
wow,
place, which was just a real one room little small place with a dirt floor. But
wow,
she was so proud of it. Everything was pretty neat,
right,
and she was very happy to have us come and visit her.
wow. So you felt like you could trust her?
Well, I did, but on the other hand, my class ring from high school, I took over with me, and I would occasionally take it off, especially when I was flying, because you wore it with gloves. So apparently, sometime I left it in the room there, and it disappeared. So
Mm,
can you trust them? Well, that was very valuable to them. So
mm.
that was a lesson learned. But yeah, they seemed reasonable. I had no reason to distrust them. The people that worked on post had been, quote, screened, end quote. I don't know what that meant exactly, but there were several people who work over in the officers club. They were the servers there, and they were the bartenders, and so they kind of were the working class in the officers club. They were the cooks over there. It wasn't until that mortar attack where they found the guy from the barber shop had been directing fire that you became extremely wary.
Yeah, tell this. I've heard this. I've heard this a few times. I don't know what it is with the with the barbers, but I've heard this story a few times. Um, and maybe, I have a thesis about this. Maybe we remember the barbers the most because, they're cutting our hair and they have these sharp instruments so close to our throats. And it turns out that we couldn't trust this guy after all. But so maybe that's why that the person who has that particular job seems to come up in these memoirs. But what happened with the barber there?
Well, most of the mortaring attacks had been directed towards the flight line, and they were trying to get aircraft. The aircraft were in revetments so that if it hit beside the aircraft, it might damage the blades, but unless they got a direct hit, it wouldn't damage the aircraft. Now, they occasionally did hit an aircraft and destroy it, but they hadn't been attacking the places where the troops lived. This was an exceptional night. And the first round incoming was extremely close. It turned out that it was 2 hooches away. And we were obviously alarmed, and we immediately climbed into our little underneath protective things under our beds, which were surrounded by steel planking. And then we would push our chicken plate that we wore when flying in the hole. So we were essentially in a bunker. And the second round did hit our hooch.
A direct hit, didn't it?
Direct hit in the hooch.
Wow.
It tore up clothes. It tore up stuff in my locker, tore up clothes in my locker. It ruined my tape recorder that I'd bought. I mean, there were rips on the blanket on the bed. I mean, it was close.
Yeah. Wow.
But
And
we all survived that because we had our little private bunkers underneath our beds.
And it turns out that the barber then had
Barber, the next day, because this was an unusual attack, they closed the gate and didn't let any civilians in, but the barber shop opened. He was already inside and he didn't know that the gate was closed. So when he opened, they arrested him, and then they searched the barber shop and they found the radio up above in the rafters that he used to direct fire.
Wow. Wow. Right. And so here's this thing where I mean, just the image of it, this guy is cutting soldiers' hair with sharp tools, and it turns out that he's working for the enemy. I mean, he's playing, he's getting paid by the US and also working for the Viet Cong. What impact did that have on you? I mean, did you, from that point on, then were you more wary when it came to civilians working on the base?
I don't think so. I think we still trusted our mama sons, but of course, by this time I'd gone and visited her house, and she was so friendly and so happy to have us there, and she was just delighted. They were really poor people. She was pregnant during the time I was there. She had a baby, and she only missed 2 days of work, and then she was back at work.
Did you have any interactions at all with South Vietnamese forces, with ARVN forces?
No, none.
Okay.
Absolutely none.
Yeah. You said that overwhelmingly, 95%, you said overwhelmingly your missions are, keeping these fire bases supplied. You did have other missions. We talked about the water buffalo mission. We talked about the, moving the Montagnard village. Another mission involved Agent Orange.
This was a one-time mission up at Dak To. Dak To was in a valley up there, and there was a ridge line to the north and the south. The larger ridge line was to the south. And Charlie, I mean, the NVA was in that ridge line. We knew that.
Yeah.
And I mean, he'd build stuff up there, but that's where they would shoot from their mortar attacks. Typically, they would drop 2 or 3 rounds. and then they would move their location, because at the time there was radar at Docto that could identify where the rounds were coming from, and they could return fire within minutes. So
The
they would just
US
drop
could.
2 or 3. They would just drop 2 or 3 rounds and then move, so that
Yeah,
the return fire didn't get them.
right. And so then the plan was to lay down some Agent Orange to get rid of that foliage so they wouldn't be able to hide under the.
Yeah, and typically they didn't shoot from the top of the ridge line. They were shooting from about a third of the way down. So the plan was for us to at least make some passes. And the ridge line was such that it wasn't like they could in many flat areas just go in there with a C-130 and spray it. They couldn't have done it with a fixed wing aircraft.
Mm,
So the 4th Infantry Division says, well, we're going to try to do this with a Chinook. Now, again, we were a terribly important resource that was very limited for the 4th Infantry Division. They could get help from the coast from other companies, but they had to go through the 1st Aviation Battalion to get help from the coast. So, I mean, their priorities had to be managed with other divisions. So we were a priority type quantity that was really limited for the 4th Infantry Division.
right.
So somewhere over there in their chemical division, they decided that they could try to use a Chinook to defoliate that ridge.
Right. And here we get to the, it's hard to think about Agent Orange from the perspective of 1967. But what you're describing is you've got these NVA forces that are, sending up more rounds and then moving quickly so they don't get hit by counterfire. And they're hard to find because you have this thick foliage. And so we're going to put down this defoliant, Agent Orange, so that they can't, it's harder for them to hide, or perhaps they won't be able to hide because it's been defoliated, which means that fewer mortar rounds come in on our guys. And so that's the rationale for
That's the rationale.
for the use of Agent Orange. We know now, looking back, it's kind of hard to believe. You hear stories of guys on the ground, saying that Agent Orange is like rain coming down on them, as they've got Agent Orange in their water, that they're in their drinking water, they'll sometimes say. And I mean, all of the ongoing problems associated with Agent Orange. What was your own thinking at the time? You have this one-time mission. What was your own thinking at the time?
Well, I had no idea how dangerous it was. I was the pilot flying it, and I had by this time I had a major actually that was flying with me, but he was just fresh to country.
Mm.
And they jury-rigged the aircraft, and my exposure really was more than you might expect because they were spraying out the back. But the airflow in the Chinook, well, if you have the front windows in the cockpit open, which you did all the time because it was so hot in there, the airflow would come up through the cabin and out the windows. So I could smell that stuff as we were spraying. So our exposure was real.
And at that time, I mean, did it go through your mind like, maybe this isn't a good idea? Or at the time was like, hey, this is.
No, I later became a pharmacist and understood all these things. But at that time, I had no understanding of anything medical.
Yeah.
And,
and of course, Agent Orange
we trusted our superiors in the Army. And I guess this is something we can do. But it was a complete jury rig. This is the only time that they used the Chinook was on this one flight. And we did it once, and then they wanted us to go again. I said, not the same day. If we stirred up a hornet's nest, we're not going back and do it the same day. I'm sorry. Talk to me tomorrow.
Yeah. Have you had any you know, decades later, this is one of the ongoing stories of Vietnam, of course, veterans contracting all sorts of health problems associated with Agent Orange. Have you had any health troubles related to Agent Orange
I have
yourself?
not, but there are two pilots from my company, these older guys, uh, that died from it, that had lung problems.
Yeah.
Um,
There's another.
had lung cancers. Now, was it Agent Orange? Well, they say it was because of the type of cancer it was, but I did have a, um, something happen to me that was because of Vietnam, but it was unrelated to Agent Orange.
What was
I grew
that?
up in Mason City, Iowa. In Mason City, Iowa, have an epidemic of histoplasmosis, which is a fungus that's slow growing, and it can attack the entire body, but typically attacks the lung. Now, when I was in basic training, I was obviously still in very good shape because I could run the mile in less than 6 minutes.
Hmm.
Okay. I was only one of two in my company that could do that. So I was still in pretty good shape. But when I was Vietnam, there was sleep deprivation and a constant anxiety. And I actually was fairly run down for a year.
Sure.
I was tired a lot. And we flew as much as 12 hours in a day. And
Wow.
flying 12 hours is a lot of flying, especially if you're making a takeoff and landing every 10 minutes.
Wow. Yeah.
It's intense. So by the time I got back, I started to lose my breath and didn't think anything of it until it was about the time to get out of the Army, at which time I was actually splitting up blood by that time. So they did a chest x-ray, and I had a huge mass on my right upper lobe of my lung. And it turned out that I had had that slow histoplasmosis infection for a long, long time, and some lymph nodes had calcified and occluded part of my lung. And just before I got out of service, then I had a lung surgery. I got a scar that starts here and goes back to here.
Wow.
And I was, again, I can't tell you how lucky I was on all these things, because of the Dr. Noto that did it had just come back from Vietnam, where he'd been mending guys' chests for months. That's what he did. He was trained in the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
Hmm.
And he knew I wanted to fly again. He told me later that if he had been in private practice, he would have simply taken the lung because it looked that bad.
Wow.
It was red and inflamed. But instead, he did a wedge resection and just took out those lymph nodes. And being young, I was back on flight status 30 days later.
Wow. But that was definitely related to your service in Vietnam.
Consequential for the year in Vietnam that I was chronically tired, and that gave that fungus time to slowly grow in that lung.
Wow. Another unusual mission you flew has to do with the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And
That was a one-time mission too.
yeah, and this is just the saga of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and just the constant efforts to stop North Vietnamese and their helpers and getting stuff down this trail. Starts in the early 60s, goes all the way into the 70s. And the trail, which I understand is a series of trails, still continues to function. Could you tell the story of the unusual mission you had in relation to trying to get some control of the trail?
Well, they made arc lights or B-52 strikes on this trail reasonably common, So the 4th Infantry Division and Chemical Division again decided, well, what if we put CNS gas on that trail after an arc light would temporarily prohibit them from working on the trail or make it very difficult for them to reestablish the trail at that point. Somebody's bright idea.
So it's it's tear gas. And so the idea is after the B-52 Arclight bombing, then these, we have to acknowledge the industry of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. They'll come in and patch things up and get the trail up and running again. So the idea is after the Arclight bombing, then to put down tear gas to prevent them from doing that. Now, as I'm hearing about this mission, I'm thinking, so how long is it going to take for the tear gas to clear out? And how much of an impact is that really going
Weeks,
to have?
weeks, because it's very persistent. This is not like the tear gas that you're used to hearing
Okay.
about from the police use. This is a very different tear gas. It's very persistent.
Okay.
And if it's disturbed, it comes back up in the air when it lays on the ground.
Oh, I see.
So
Okay.
it's a different tear gas than what you're accustomed to.
Oh,
Now, so they put roller tracks on the base of the floor of the Chinook, and they filled it with 55-gallon drums of this persistent gas. And so we're going to drop essentially 5,000 to 7,000 pounds of tear gas onto this site that was just bombed by B-52s a few days before.
yeah.
Now, the problem with this, first of all, I knew where this valley was, and we never flew in this valley. We knew this was a bad place. There were 50 cals in there. This was not a good place to fly. We never flew there. Had we had to fly over there, I would have been at least 5,000 feet above it. Okay. They wanted me to drop from 500 feet above the ground because that's what they had the fuses and the explosive rig for, so that it would disperse 100 feet above the ground. And so I had to be right over the trail at 500 feet. That's the zap zone. That's right in the middle of the zap zone. That's the most dangerous altitude you could be flying. So we came in high, and we had gunships behind us.
Okay. Yeah.
And well, we did too on the Agent Orange thing when we went across that ridge line. We had gunships behind us. So if they saw anybody firing at us, they could return fire at least, because our little machine guns wasn't going to do much. So we had to drop in very quickly and fly at 500 feet above where they had just bombed. And as they pushed these barrels out, now these barrels had lanyards on them that were attached to a cable, was a jump cable, although we never had anyone jump, so that when the barrel came out, it was activated when it dropped off the ramp. And then it dropped and blew up above the trail.
Wow.
So we flew long enough for them to get the barrels pushed out. They would signal and push the barrels out, and they pushed them all out. And then as soon as the last one was out, they let me know. And of course, then I pulled full power and we climbed very rapidly to high altitude.
Got out.
That thing will climb amazingly fast when it's empty.
I'll bet. Did you hear anything, any report on whether this mission was
Gunships didn't see
successful?
anything, and they never had us do it again either.
So
that was a one-time shot, just like the Agent Orange thing was a one-time shot.
Yeah, and I've never heard of. I mean, obviously I've heard about Agent Orange constantly, but using the tear gas over the trail, it sounds like it was sort of an experiment.
Jim
I
Wetherell
hadn't heard of that.
did a tear gas mission too. I don't know when, but he mentions it in his book. As a matter of fact, he had one of those things explode inside the aircraft.
Oh,
Now, we were wearing gas masks when we flew with this tear gas.
I see. Wow.
And everyone on board was wearing a gas mask.
You did a full year. So was it August 67 to August 68? Was that your service?
Well, I got out actually 1 week early. Now, and I took 2 R&Rs. Again, how lucky can you be? Most people only got 1. I got 2. So I was gone 20 days for R&Rs, almost 3 weeks. I left a week early. And then the last 3 weeks after I got my orders, we had enough pilots by that time. They typically stop you somewhere and you don't know exactly where, because you start making different choices. You get short.
Because you're so close.
Make different decisions about what you do. So they stopped me 3 weeks early, and I continued to work as the assistant operations officer for 3 weeks, but I didn't actually fly for the last 3 weeks I was in Vietnam.
Okay.
So I had about 7 weeks out of the 51, out of the 52 weeks that I didn't fly.
Mm.
But I still ended up with more hours than anyone else had ever flown in that company. I had well over 1,000 hours of flying, and nobody had flown that much before in that company.
Wow.
I was also the first person to ever leave that company that never took a round in the aircraft. And I don't know of any other pilot that I ever flew with that can say that they never took a round in the aircraft while they were over there.
And I think you also say that your door gunners never
No, they
returned
never
fire.
fired. Vern Matty impressed me right off the bat. You don't let them fire unless you're getting fired at. They can identify where they're firing from, and they can accurately return fire. Otherwise, you're just asking them to shoot you.
Mm.
No. So again, I was never, well, the one time that I was extremely concerned is that night tactical emergency resupplying ammunition, small ammunition at Khartoum, when the Huey in front of me, I could see was taking tracers because they were leaving the aircraft at a different angle than they were going in the aircraft. And I was behind him about a half mile. But because he took fire, the people on the ground returned fire and suppressed it while I was in there. So no, I didn't want my guys to be shooting at that, because that would just tell them where I'm. It would just identify where I'm at. I'm lights off. I'm making a landing. I don't even have very light, very, very minimal cockpit lights on.
Right. Wow. You come home then in the late summer of 68. Things are, I think around that time, the president in Westmoreland are saying, I think the phrase I think that's being used is the light at the end of the tunnel, and Ted's going to come, and then the conversation will, change. But certainly in terms of protests, anti-war sentiment, things were certainly heating up.
But
And-
because of Tet,
yeah.
mostly, I think.
And you say in what you've written that the country you returned to was a different country from the one you left a year before. How had the country changed in that year?
But just from my perspective, when I went over when I was 19 years old in Mason City, they wished me well, and they would give you support. When I get back, it wasn't that way. They just, oh, you were over there, huh? What are we doing over there? Why were we over there? Why were you over there? Why didn't you just avoid the draft? That kind of attitude is what I saw after I got back, as compared to wishing you well before I left. And even when I was down at Fort Benning, we were military, but we tried to wear our hair as long as we could, because when we got off post, we changed immediately into civilian clothes, and we didn't tell anybody we were military, but it became obvious. First of all, you're around Fort Benning, and you're shorter than most of the kids going to college. And so, you were identified.
So you feel like when you came back, it sounds like you had people who said things to you that, conveyed a certain, disregard, disrespect, apathy.
Antagonism and apathy. They were antagonistic about the whole war by then, many of the same people that hadn't been before we left. Now, my family and my relatives never displayed any of that, but they weren't affected. I was the only one of my cousins that went to Vietnam.
Was your experience similar to what I've heard from other vets? You get out of the Army, and because of what you experienced when you came home, was the experience I often hear is this, and I'm interested in knowing what your experience was like. Guys will get out of the military, whatever branch, and they won't talk about Vietnam. They'll kind of put it away to the extent they can, move on, um, not bring it up. Maybe if they're applying for a job, maybe try to get around saying I've been in the military, although that's obviously going to be a hard thing to do if it involves a couple of years of your life. Just trying to, and to the extent possible, just not letting people know that you had served in the military. Was
I
that
let
your
my hair grow.
experience?
I let my hair grow longer. Yeah. Um, for a while when I first got out, and I got a job as a bartender
Hmm.
for a while, and then I got a job as a lake patrol officer. But I did get that job in part because I had military service. The guy that was the hiring over there, Earl Irv, he was ex-military, and when he found out that I was an ex-military helicopter pilot, he said, "Well, you can work for me." So I did get that job that way, and I spent a summer over there being a lake patrol officer. But then I went on to Iowa State University, and by this time we're about 4 years older than most, so we're kind of in a group by ourselves. We're older,
Hmm.
and we're atypical students as freshmen, so we kind of stand out anyway. So the people pretty well figured out you must have been in the service for a while. So I did associate with veterans, and I joined the Veterans Club. And I actually worked as a veterans advisor. Then I got a job on campus, and had supplemented the GI Bill. And I read up on the regulations and became an advisor. And they paid me to sit in an office, and when people came in, help them with the paperwork or whatever needed to be done. And I
Hmm.
did that for a couple of years.
Okay.
So I was still associated with veterans. No, we didn't really talk about the war much, but we did have something in common, in that we were veterans.
You said that the country had changed in your year over in Vietnam. How had you changed? You fly into
I grew
Vietnam.
up in Vietnam, literally.
Yeah.
I mean, I became from a very naive person to somebody that understood a lot more. I was a young, just co-pilot when I got over there, although I was confident because I'd been selected for Chinook school. But by the time I got back, I became very confident in myself because, for example, Vern Maddie was an assistant operations officer. And I tell the story in that thing about you needed something to do in your spare time. Many guys would go over to the officers club and spend time over there. I started playing cards, and I ended up playing cards with two of the operations officers up in the Major's Hooch. And I was a good card player, and I enjoyed playing. But my association with them led to one of the guys that was an operations officer, but was going to become the operations officer, actually hiring me when Vern Maddie left. So here I am, just barely, at the time I was even a W1, and now I'm an assistant operations officer replacing a seasoned CW4. There were an awful lot of people that were angry about that, but left it under this. But here's this young guy, all of a sudden, that gets a plum job, a good job. But I was confident in myself by that time. I had been dealing with these majors and captains in a different way than most warrants for a significant amount of time now, primarily through playing cards, but also being a mission lead and flying with some of these guys. And so I was fairly confident when I came home. So I was a changed person.
Yeah,
I grew up over there.
I can imagine. Is there anything else that comes to mind that you'd like to relate?
I just reiterate that I have to be one of the luckiest helicopter pilots to ever fly in Vietnam. I was lucky in so many ways, just so many ways.
Being on a Chinook and, to your knowledge, never taking fire, the Chinook has never hit. That's one.
Yeah, I'd been shot at, I know, but
Okay.
never hit.
Yeah, that's one of the ways you're lucky, the connections that you
The
were
fact
just
that I was
talking
flying
about.
Chinooks, I was I was the first class that had turnaround students that went into Chinooks instead of becoming Huey pilots. You know, two of my three roommates got killed over there flying Hueys. Um, the the fact that those people that I learned to fly in Vietnam were so experienced and taught me so much. How extremely lucky that way, you know.
Tell us the names of your two roommates who did not survive the war.
Vern Looning was a roommate that got killed over there, and Robert Deshane was a roommate that got killed over there. And they were both great people. Vern Looning got married just before he left for Vietnam, and of course he didn't come back. And Robert Deshane was a nice guy from Maine, just a real nice guy and quiet, and they both got killed over there. It's really, yeah, it's really sad.
Yeah. Could you relate the story of the Chinook that had the failure, and then this led to everyone on board being lost?
Well, again, this is part of how I was so lucky, because I was flying as an aircraft commander, and we were flying out of Kontum to a fire base west of there. And I had just dropped off a load and just rotated to go back to Kontum, and had just rotated, and a terrible noise came from the back end of the aircraft. I mean, like a screaming noise, very loud. And I made a tight circle and landed back on the fire base on a relatively smooth part of the ground there, and planted it and pulled the engines back because of that screaming noise. And the engine, I mean, the blades came to a break, stop, as if you had a rotor brake, but the Chinook does not have a rotor brake. But it wasn't a sudden stoppage like they hit something. It was more like a brake had been applied. That fire base had been overrun, nearly overrun, within the last week. It was not a good place to be at night. I called back maintenance because we were actually close enough. We were about 15 miles from Pleiku, and I could talk on the FM radio still to my maintenance crew back in Pleiku. And Dale Kroll was the maintenance officer at the time, or one of the maintenance officers, and we had a long conversation. Then he had a long conversation with the flight engineer on the aircraft. They decided to bring up parts and change that transmission in both nose boxes. They decided that probably the main transmissions were okay because there wasn't a sudden stoppage. So they brought a crew up to do that, complete with, they had hoists that you could attach to the aircraft so you could move these things around. Well, they worked all day up there replacing that transmission. They gave me the aircraft that they'd brought up, and I continued flying my missions that day. And that night I was back in operations waiting for them to come home. They did a run up on that, and they checked the chip detectors, and there were no particles on the chip detectors. Normally they would do a maintenance flight, a longer run up, a much longer run up, and testing that transmission, and then they'd do a short maintenance flight with only 3 people on board. Because that fire base had been overrun, or nearly overrun, within the last week, they decided to load everybody on board and make the short 15-minute flight back to Pleiku. They got about halfway back, and that new transmission failed at about 5,000 feet, and it came apart in the air. It was a big fireball. Everybody on board, of course, was killed.